Hello and welcome everyone to our event tonight. I'm Kayla Brzezinski, the Assistant Director at the Museum of the White Mountains. As we gather today, we are all on Indigenous lands. For those of you joining us from home, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous presence in your area, both past and present. Those of us at the MWM are on Indakana, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. We are grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. For those of you on Zoom, we've put a link in the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous histories of your place at nativeland.ca, as well as the Abenaki peoples of Northern New England through the Musée de Abenaki in Quebec. So tonight, for our final Spotlight on the Humanities and Sustainability Studies series event for this semester, we are grateful to be joined by one of our collaborators on the Spotlight on the Humanities and Sustainability Studies grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Suzanne Gallagher. Okay. Suzanne is an associate professor in public health here at PSU and is the associate director at the Center for Healthy Communities, and she will introduce tonight's speaker for us tonight. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Suzanne, and it is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Semra Aytur. Yeah, perfect. And this is going to be a really fun talk because there's not much that can get better than like the intersection of all these wonderful things, art and science and nature. And so tonight, Semra is going to talk with us about these intersecting concepts and art, science, nature, and healthy communities. She's done a lot of work in planetary health and looking at the role of different environments, natural environment, built environment on the health of people and on the health of the environment. And this talk in particular is going to integrate art and science and public health and environmental justice, and including, I'm hoping, and she assured me, talking about her own practice as an artist. And Semra is a professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the University of New Hampshire. Her research focuses on community resilience and the relationship between the different kinds of environments that we all move about in. She's a very published author and has done a lot of work with qualitative methods and using photography and story as a way of gathering information and data from and with communities. We'll strike that front part and just say with. And so I am lucky I get to co-facilitate or co-chair a committee with Semra with the New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action. And so we co-chair the climate justice group together. And so we get to do some work on climate justice. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for that introduction. And I'm so grateful to be here with you all tonight. Thank you all for coming out. And this talk is especially meaningful for me today because I'm giving this talk in memory of my dad, who just passed away on October 22nd. So I am here to celebrate his life and also, as Suzanne mentioned, talk about my favorite topics, art, science, nature, that nexus. And my dad was really a person who integrated all of those professionally and personally and inspired me to try to do a little bit of that with the help of wonderful colleagues like Suzanne and hopefully some new friends that I'll get to meet tonight. So with that, I'm going to start just with a little really brief introduction showing my dad, who's the guy on the left. So my dad, Dr. Semra Aytur, was born in Istanbul, Turkey in 1928. And he actually came to the United States on a Fulbright scholarship in 1953 and spent some time doing his medical residency at several different institutions in the US, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Staten Island, New York, and eventually ended up in Plattsburgh, which for those of you who know upstate New York, it's right across the lake from Burlington, Vermont. So at the time, it was a very rural place, and it's changed a little bit over the years. But when my dad first started practicing medicine, he showed me that the hospital, and it was like a Victorian house that had been converted to treat patients. It was literally like somebody's house. And then it's grown into this kind of more modern hospital, CVPH Medical Center. And my dad practiced there for 40 years as a community physician, treating people. Often he treated patients for their entire life. So healthcare was delivered a little bit differently when he started, and he really enjoyed the relationships that he was able to build. And let's see the next one. My dad was also an artist. So he painted and sketched and pretty much was drawing all the time. Usually if he was in our house and watching TV, he would be doodling on a napkin. So we still have all kinds of little scraps of paper lying around with portraits and cats and dogs and landscapes. And it was just a wonderful thing to find. Actually, we're still finding them, my brother and I, today. So he left a really wonderful kind of trail of art, a comet trail of art. And we are still enjoying that. And he integrated that with his practice of medicine, but also he just loved nature. And he was one of those people who appreciated, I think, the wonder of the natural world in a way through his whole life that was just almost like a childlike curiosity of the natural world, and found inspiration for his art, but also I think used that to inspire the art of medicine, the part of medicine that is about the humanistic process. And medicine has a lot of science to it, and my dad enjoyed the scientific component, but at the end of the day, it's about compassion, it's about caring and forging bonds with people. So my goals for this presentation, kind of building on that, Suzanne already set the stage beautifully. I'm going to discuss the importance of bridging art, science, and nature using this planetary health lens, which I'll define a little bit later, and provide some examples of ways to integrate art and science, thinking about public health, environmental justice, and hopefully I've already heard there's some students who are coming from different majors. So really, I think this is a great way to think about intersectionality and transdisciplinarity, because it takes a village to address some of the complex societal problems and ecological problems that we're facing. And we're going to talk about engaging through examples, engaging citizens, partnering with communities, cross-sectoral partnerships. And I'll show examples of different community partners and artists that I have just been fortunate to know. Some of them I've just met, some of them I've only known virtually, some of them I've known for much longer, but all of them are doing just such profound acts of, I think, social change, using art as a way to think about civic participation, as well as personal growth, and the way that we can build both self-efficacy and collective action simultaneously. So I'll show you just a couple of examples. There are so many more out there. And at the very end of this talk, I've got a little survey where if you know a great artist that just you've been inspired by, you can drop a line in the Qualtrics survey after. I'd love to hear about it. I love learning about new people. So we'll define a few terms just to kind of build a common language for today. Planetary health, some of you might be familiar with this term, but it's really defined as the health of human civilization and the ecosystem services on which life depends. Our air, our water, our soil, all of the fabric, the microbiota that holds our living world together. And it's a solutions-oriented, transdisciplinary social movement. So it's also about people working together, artists, scientists, change agents, people who really just believe that together we can make a difference, and we can think about honoring the Earth systems and the reciprocal cycles that keep us alive, our interaction with nature. And it focuses on the interdependence of people and the environment. The other thing I like about planetary health, which in public health has just sort of become a term really in the past couple of years, I'd say you see journal articles about it, but really it is a big umbrella under which some other movements in public health kind of find a new home. So environmental justice, eco-health, One Health, which is the intersection of plants, animals, and nature, the geo-health, occupational health movement, all of these, which still have their own identities, but are very much part of the planetary health movement. So now I have friends who I think are all finding a new home where we can collaborate even in different ways under the planetary health umbrella. The other way that I love to think about planetary health is actually through the words of Martin Luther King. And Dr. King said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And I think that interdependence is what really we're talking about today, or what I would love to talk about, and hopefully have some time for Q&A afterwards. And the different artists that I'm going to showcase all, I think, embody this through their work in a different way, but get to the spirit of, I think, this quote by Dr. King. The other model that I know both Suzanne and I talk about quite a bit with our students in public health is the social ecological model. And what I like about this model is it talks about how our individual health, or it really posits that our individual health, if we think about this like layers of an onion, are influenced by surrounding layers, such as interpersonal relationships, our relationships with friends and family, our communities, our institutions, how our civic organizations function. And then we have policies and environments. Policies also affect environments. So there's a potential unpacking of the yellow layer there. And then the layer culture out in red is where we might find the humanities and the arts and all of the ways in which we speak to each other in those humanistic terms that I think provides this overlay and trickles down to affect our health, permeating all of the other levels beneath it. So it's part of planetary health. Sometimes there's another layer around the culture that people label as the planetary layer, but I think the culture and the planetary are pretty seamless, at least in my way of thinking about it. The other term that people who work in epidemiology, like myself, have been returning to, it was actually a term from the 1990s, but ever since COVID, epidemiologists have been talking about syndemics again. And the reason I wanted to bring syndemics to your attention today as part of this talk is because it refers to multiple interacting pandemics or epidemics that synergistically create even greater disruption. So by that, I mean, if we think of COVID, which we've all lived through, but at the same time, we are still living through the climate crisis, issues with systemic racism, other ongoing epidemics that haven't gone away. They were ongoing throughout COVID, the opioid epidemic, the obesity epidemic. We could say that we have an epidemic with loneliness. There are papers written about that. So all of these things are kind of coalescing and creating what is termed a syndemic. I think it's also a really interesting literature that if anyone is interested, you can see the original paper, which was Meryl Singer's work with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, thinking about interactions with an infectious disease, but the intersections with violence and some other processes. And now if we think about the newer papers, which are wrapping climate change and environmental justice and systemic racism into those kind of root causes, thinking about how syndemics are affecting us every day. And that is also why we need the arts. So I think whenever we think about syndemics and syndemic stress, the stress that results from living through these multiple intersecting epidemics all the time, we really need the arts and the humanities more than ever, I would say. And the arts allow us to do a couple of things, probably many more things than are listed here, but examine what it means to be human, to voice, express, and bring people, places, and ideas together, to create wellness in our day-to-day lives by helping us process our experiences, to build more resilient communities through social connectedness, communication, thinking about our built environment, our natural environment. How do we steward those ecosystem services that our lives depend on? And in times of social injustice and unrest, the arts can amplify important voices and messages and make the invisible visible. And one of the techniques that I use to do that is a technique called photo voice, which I use in my research with communities. And I'll just share that as one example, but there are many, many other examples of making the invisible visible through the arts. There are also some really interesting historical roots here. And as I was preparing for this talk, I was reminded of this mural, The Cave of Hands in Argentina, which is a cave painting with many, many handprints. I haven't seen this in real life, but would love to someday. And the handprints were made by applying this blowing paint material through hollowed out bones or reeds. So going all the way back to 7,300 BC, that's when this is estimated to have been created. But really the sea of overlapping hands, again, I think reminds us of that quote by Dr. King, that interconnectedness, that even primitive people placing their hands on the wall must have felt that. They must have, and they left it there to build a connection for us to the present day. The other term, which I saw a couple of my friends from the New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Justice are joining this talk. Reb McKenzie, a social worker who's a friend of mine, first introduced me to the work of Bob Doppelt, who is a psychologist working in an area called transformational resilience. And he's got a book out, which he actually has a new book out too, I think. But what I love about this concept that my friend Reb introduced me to is that it talks about collective resilience, sort of combining our individual coping mechanisms. When we think about how we are resilient as individual people, it's all about how we cope with adversity and hopefully find a way to use our own coping skills to move ahead with our lives. But then there's community resilience, and how do we think about building the structures through our community fabric, through that interconnectedness, that connective tissue that Dr. King spoke about, to create more resilient communities. And I think it's on the next slide here, Bob Doppelt actually has two terms that he says can help us to forge that intersection between individual resilience and community resilience. And when you put the two and two together, he has this term transformational resilience. And there are actually strategies that we can learn, that we can engage in together, that help us to create transformational resilience. We can learn how to do it. We can practice it. And two kinds of strategies that I think the arts can contribute to are presencing, which are really more those kind of mindful, reflective practices. When one is engaged in any type of artistic expression, often one is doing a presencing type of activity, kind of centering yourself. Sometimes you just focus inward a little bit. And whether you're a musician, a painter, someone doing dance or weaving a tapestry, you're just becoming one with what you're doing with your hands or your body or your mind. And so that presencing mindfulness practices are another form of that, is something that we can do to take care of ourselves, to build that personal level of resilience. But then purposing, which is the other really important piece, is how do we move from taking care of ourselves to taking care of each other, and using, kind of channeling that energy to think about being agents of social change, supporting collective action. And when we do that, that not only arguably helps our own efficacy and our own resilience, but it really helps to build these resilient communities. And transformational resilience is something that just keeps building the more we can engage in these practices. And I think the arts do both. I think it's one of the things I can think of that artistic expression really does both simultaneously. And when we find community, like events like this, that purposing piece can even explode potentially into something bigger. The other thing to really be mindful of here, returning again to the more environmental justice side of this, is that As powerful as nature is, and we talked about how we depend on these ecosystem services, so many people do not have access to nature. They're disconnected from nature. Many of us are very fortunate, and this beautiful museum and in such a beautiful place is a place that I think I can feel a real connection to nature here. But for example, communities of color are 3 times more likely than white communities to live in what are called nature-deprived areas. Those are areas that have little to no access to parks, trails, green space, blue space, which is our water resources. And 75% of non-white families with children lack, they have less natural land than whatever the average is for their state. So it's kind of a relative risk measure. But that's a lot of kids. That's a lot of kids who aren't fortunate to be in the kinds of spaces that we are in today. We also know on the flip side, as we've said, that access to nature and outdoor experiences can be keys to building community resilience. Many people do find ways to achieve presencing and purposing through nature. So as we think about collective action, thinking about ways to offer ways of connecting with nature to people who don't currently have that, and that can happen through policy, environmental, and systems change, and also through the arts, I think, raising that awareness. The other thing that I'm encouraged to see is there are now papers about art as a social determinant of health. I kept thinking as I was preparing this talk, I thought, art should really be a social determinant of health. And lo and behold, there are papers in the Lancet. There are now a lot of papers. I found just a couple of them here. But social determinants of health are a term that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, those of us who work in public health know all about the CDC, defines as the conditions in which we live, work, learn, and play. So it's really that sense of place in that social and environmental ecological model. All of those layers that surround us are part of our social determinants of health. And it includes things like our access to food, our access to clean water, our access to health insurance might be one, access to transportation, safe housing, but access to nature is one. And being able to access the arts or participate in ways that one can find artistic expression and community, I think should be, and apparently now is being recognized as a social determinant, which is really encouraging. And the other thing that I think is really important here is this can then allow us to sometimes shift our perspective on adversity. So when we talk about syndemic stress, and there's so much that I know many of us, including myself, feeling grief and anxiety and all of the emotions that our journey through life takes us to, sometimes those are painful. And they also, though, can I think be part of that transformational resilience. And art can help us to work through and with those emotions, sometimes even reframing them. And with that, I wanted to share just a couple of examples where I am so moved by what these artists are doing. So one example of that reframing that I learned about just by chance, I think I actually found out about this project when I'm an oil painter. So I was looking for some new paints that I wanted to buy. And I found out about this project that had been conducted in Ohio. And it started out as a partnership by an environmental engineer and an artist and their students. So students just like you, who I guess knew both of these professors, and they lived in a part of Ohio where there's a lot of acid mine drainage. Acid mine drainage creates that yellow kind of browny contamination of the water that you can see up in the top photo. And it is very toxic. It is very toxic for the people living in those communities, toxic to the ecosystems. It's a real environmental justice issue, environmental injustice issue. And it's really created by the iron oxide runoff. It's really impacting a lot of Ohio's waterways. So these professors figured out, I'm not sure about the chemistry because I'm not a chemist, but they were able to take the iron oxide sludge and through a process that apparently took them 6 years to develop, to distill the pigment and create paints out of that pigment, turning some of that toxic sludge into something quite beautiful. I'll show you some examples. And you can see the professor below is using it now in his work. His work has been featured at the United Nations. It's really been an amazing story. And at the same time, they're using the proceeds from selling those paints, not just to artists like myself, but apparently they're also selling them for some commercial and industrial uses for like painting the undersides of boats and I think houses. I forgot, there's commercial grade paint as well. So through this, they've integrated art and science. They're giving the proceeds back to the communities that are affected by this issue. And I was so struck by the quote, I think that one of the professors shared in a recent documentary that has just been released. He said that when he would talk to children in the community and ask them to draw a stream, they would reach for an orange crayon, not a blue crayon, an orange one. And that just really, really struck me. And then I found out that just in 2023, apparently there's a documentary about this. There is a short YouTube video, which I think I also shared, or if not, you can email me. That's only 5 minutes that everybody should watch. But I'd love to see the documentary. So maybe look out for that. And maybe we have another event about that. But this is just a great example. And here, I guess, is a little demo of part of the way that they're working with the sludge and turning it into the pigment for the paints. Here's a quote from the artist John Sabra, who said, "With little funding and a lot of skepticism, we've been refining a process that can continuously treat acid mine drainage, restore a stream for aquatic life, and collect sustainably sourced iron pigment that can be sold, offsetting the operational costs, and then hopefully making a little bit of a profit, eliminating some of the sources of pollution and giving back to those communities." So I just thought this is such a powerful example. I've also been able to use some of that in my own artwork. I live in Maine and I'm fortunate to live near the Rachel Carson National Wilderness and often go there to paint when I need a little bit of presencing myself. And you can see the kind of orangey color in this painting that I did in Maine is using some of that paint that is now available to artists. So that's just one example that I've been really, really fortunate to benefit from their work. We also have done, my husband John is here, and we do a lot of events in Maine where we live on ocean health. And John has a startup company known as Marine Microverse Institute, which is really celebrating blue space, which is our water resources, the importance of water in our lives. And we do some citizen science projects. We have Ocean Health Day every year, and we try to integrate the arts into that. We're trying to increase the artistic presence, but we also do a lot of science. So we have a small lab in a box, which is the little black box you can see our student Trevor is demonstrating, which actually does PCR grade analysis of what kinds of contaminants are in the water. So people who are visiting the beach can actually see in real time what kinds of pollutants might be in their water. We educate people about plastic and reef-safe sunscreen and a lot of other things, but it's a really great way to have conversations with people. And we even have a GIS story map there if anyone wants to look at this, but it's been a really fun project. And I think it is another way to think about what are the ecosystem services that we all care about. And in Maine, a lot of people love to go to the beach. So it's a great way to engage in conversation with people. It also allowed me to learn about other amazing artists doing work to save the ocean. This one is from Oregon. The work originated in Oregon. It's called Washed Ashore. And this project I also heard about a number of years ago, but it's still going. It has a whole museum now dedicated to Washed Ashore. And it has a YouTube video also if you want to Google Washed Ashore, but it goes on the road and they have these humongous sculptures that are all made from usually plastic that was found in the ocean. So it is also toxins turned into art, but they're life-size three-dimensional sculptures. And the mission of this organization is to build and exhibit aesthetically powerful art to educate the global audience about plastic pollution in the ocean and waterways, and spark positive change in consumer habits. And if you go on their little website, you will be amazed at what they've created. It's so inspiring. So washed ashore. The other thing I wanted to mention a little bit, kind of circling back to my dad and the inspiration that he provided, is the role of art in medicine. So increasingly, many doctors that I know, actually, not just my dad, have found a way to integrate some type of art into their personal and professional life. Some are painters, like my dad, love to paint. I know some that are musicians, and probably there's a lot of other art forms that people do in clinical work, nurses, doctors, our physical therapists, the people who really help engage with patients, sometimes in very difficult situations, end of life situations. And more, we are finding that the arts can be so helpful, both to patients and to providers. And sometimes it is creating that humanistic space for patients and providers to even engage in ways that they might not have expected. And I know my dad felt that. And my mom actually also became an artist kind of late in her life. She died of breast cancer in 2010. And before her diagnosis, she was an artist her whole life, but mostly dealt with textiles. She was a person who knit and crocheted and did amazing things with yarn, but she turned to painting during probably the last 2 years of really difficult chemotherapy treatments. And literally what seemed overnight started to produce watercolors that look like this. And they just brought her a lot of comfort. And suddenly she would just produce like a painting a day. It was really, really amazing. And again, I have those paintings and I look at them every day, and it's just such a powerful, powerful message. So I think, again, these can really help providers, they can help patients. Many hospitals now have spaces where art is on the wall and artists are engaging with patients. There have been studies showing a relationship between either actively doing art or passively viewing art really can have a number of health effects that we can measure scientifically. Biomarkers like cortisol, endorphins, hormones, and all kinds of things associated with pain actually go down when people engage in artistic expression. And I understand Suzanne might be measuring some cool things about art that maybe she can talk about later. So this is a really interesting area of research, I think, to say, well, now that we have interesting ways of measuring our response to stress, what is really happening? And by infusing healthcare settings with creative ways to connect to beauty and each other, the arts can engage us in moments of joy and gratitude, even when we're dying. We can be living while we're dying. Whoops, let me go back to this one. So make sure I didn't skip one. Yeah, so I think this one I've mostly talked about already, but there are some interesting research citations at the bottom. If you do want to know a little more about what they're finding in terms of how art can help support our immune system and helps us to process trauma, as we already talked about. And emerging research also suggests that our brain network connectivity, the neuroplasticity in our brain, can actually change when people engage with nature. That had been studied first. And when people engage in the arts. And I want to see a study that looks at when people engage in nature and the arts at the same time. So maybe we'll have to work on that one, Suzanne. But really, I think it's, again, we can use functional MRI. We can use different tools now as scientists that measure what is happening when our brains are on art. And this study is one that I did with some colleagues. It isn't quite the nature and art study that I really wanted to do, but it's getting a little bit closer. And it's a study where we enrolled patients who identified as being in chronic pain. And they were people who had suffered from chronic pain for a long time. They participated in recreational therapy, which is really how therapists work with people to enjoy whatever it was they might have enjoyed it might have been gardening, it might have been art. So some people do art, but some people said, you know, I've always loved gardening. Can you help me find a way to continue gardening? And recreational therapists are people who are trained to help people do those things, even when they might have spinal cord injuries, or they might have a mobility impairment. Maybe they have to do things a little bit differently, but they can find a way to do the activities that they loved. And they also participated in a cognitive behavioral therapy program known as Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or ACT, which is a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy program. So it's kind of the presencing piece again. So what you're seeing here, you don't have to be a neuroscience person, but if you are, there are parts of the brain that are known to be the networks affected by pain. And when people have been in pain for a long time, those networks are actually hyper aroused. They're kind of working too hard. So people's perception of pain is higher than what it normally is. And what we found is that before the intervention, before they participated in the recreational therapy and ACT intervention, the blue bars represent parts of their brain that were all higher than they should have been, kind of this hyper aroused state. And the orange bars are those same brain networks, the little letters just refer to parts of your brain, that all went down, kind of returning to a more restful state after they participated in 4 weeks of this intervention. And there have been other studies. This was a fairly small pilot study, but just really exciting. And I got to know many of the participants in the study who talked about their experience, which was also really interesting. So less pain, less depression, many other outcomes that the participants reported. The next artist that I wanted to talk about a little is an artist that I have only met virtually, not yet in person, but Devorah Newmark is an artist who recently spoke on the New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action webinar series. And if you've never gone to these, check out the website, which is the last link at the bottom. And there are so many great webinars that anyone can look at for free. They're archived, so you could look for this one if you missed it. And shout out to New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action, because they really bring in some great speakers. And Devorah Newmark and Stephanie Acker spoke at the last one just last week and just showed some amazing slides about their work, both their own art. This is Devorah Newmark's Letters to Ice series about the way that ice is receding. And she has, or they have a number of different projects about ecosystems and the collapse of our different systems. But they also work with refugees and work with people who have been displaced either due to climate or war or other ways that people lose connection to their home. So there's a lot there. And one of the things that Devorah Newmark spoke about is the way that people try to find beauty if they have lost something, whether it's grief for a person or loss of one's home or loss of the whole glacier in this case. There are ways that people try to find beauty through that experience. And there's a whole bunch of different great things on their website, which I encourage you to go to. But there is the Letters to Ice. There's also Letters to Water. And I highlighted this one because it shows the civic action piece, the way that we get to the purposing part of this. So one of the examples shared by Devorah Newmark is that they collected and read letters around the world from people around the world about their relationship with water, and acknowledging that 1 million gallons of, again, mine wastewater, kind of similar to what we saw in Ohio. In this case, they were working in Colorado with Indigenous people who were affected by the wastewater coming from the mines in that part of the country. And the mine waste made its way along the San Juan River, impacting the Navajo Nation in this case. Many, many farmers were impacted and the entire local ecosystem. So what they did collectively, this is the collective action piece, they worked together through water protectors and were eventually part of the movement that stopped the Dakota Access Pipeline. So if you're all familiar at all with, there was a lot of press at the time about that. But there's also a neat quote, I think, that reminds us it's not just the Arctic ice which recedes each year, just as irreplaceable is the culture, the wisdom that has allowed the Inuit to thrive in the far north for so long. So some really powerful quotes and combinations of different mediums, narrative, stories, reflection, art installations, and the Ode to Water series. And then I wanted to bring us back to New Hampshire. So we heard about how the warming of the ice is affecting people in Canada. That's where Deborah Newmark mostly practices their art. But here in New Hampshire, people have already been expressing some similar concerns about climate change. And this is from a survey shared by my colleagues at UNH, Lauren Ferguson. See how I'm doing on time. And noticing that a survey that they did of people working in outdoor occupations, people working in parks and recreation and all kinds of other outdoor occupations, were concerned about shorter winters and fluctuating water levels, warmer seasons, fewer days of snow and ice. These are the percentages of participants from a fairly large survey that are already concerned about that here. So it's not just people far away. It's here, it's our home. This is another example from a project that Deborah Newmark shared from people living in refugee camps and thinking about ways to make their home beautiful. One of the quotes that was shared was that as refugees, we lose our sense of beauty. And when that happens, we lose our sense of everything, of life itself. So there were a lot of examples of people doing simple things like repainting parts of their homes, planting little gardens, little potted plants, and small things, but small things that made such a large difference. So there's a whole bunch of experiences and things that are shared on this. This is from New Orleans, but also again on Deborah's website about this beautification of home concept. And we see that in New Hampshire too. I'll share a little bit of that through my photo voice work with refugees in Manchester. So photo voice is a type of qualitative participatory action research where people are given cameras and they're asked to take pictures of themes in their everyday lives, really what affects their everyday lives and their experience, their health, their well-being. They're just asked to tell a story using the camera, and then they can sometimes put a short caption in words. So they're creating art that tells their own story, and it's meant to empower people to advocate for their own health. So the other thing that Photo Voice does is once people take their photos, they share them in a group and participate in a facilitated dialogue. And then eventually they share those through some kind of collective experience. Sometimes it's an art exhibit. Sometimes it's, we did a protest once in the mayor's office. It's really up to the participants how they want to share their work, but it moves from I to we and sometimes can result in civic action if that is what the group chooses to do. So let me share just a little bit about where the Manchester Youth Photo Voice project was conducted. So if any of you know New Hampshire and know Manchester, this is the center city part of Manchester where there are a lot of different health issues in the red and orange neighborhoods, which are just kind of census blocks, parts of Manchester where there are increased rates of heart disease and other health issues that people are facing who live in those neighborhoods. And also many people living in those neighborhoods are refugees who have come to Manchester as part of refugee resettlement programs. So there are people from all over the world living in parts of these neighborhoods. And the persons who participated in my project identified as being from Sudan, Somalia, Tanzania, and Rwanda. And I did have a few folks who also identified as being an African American. So they had lived in America for a long time. And then I had people from Africa. So that was really interesting too. But I'll share with you some photos that the youth took. So going back to when we think about being disconnected from nature, some of the youth were coming from countries where they had been able to engage with nature a little bit more regularly, but then we're living in refugee resettlement housing that looks a lot like this. And one of the things they would tell us is, well, this is our playground. This is where we have to go outside to play because many of them didn't have access to a car. Mom and dad were working and couldn't take them to after school events. So this is where they would kick a soccer ball around and play. And that's their playground. And you can see the quote, "We should work together to fix this." That's getting a little bit toward the collective action piece. Many of them notice that there is a lot of advertising for cigarettes and alcohol very close to some of the parks where youth play. And I think this is one where the words speak so well. This young participant said, "Smoking is bad for you, yet the advertising is big and eye-catching. It's weird that these ads are so close to a place that is healthy and good." And just seeing that and then being able to kind of shift that narrative around and call that out, taking some of the power, I think, back was something that we talked about a lot with these youth. This is kind of a success story. So many of the youth commented on vacant lots that looked abandoned and asked, why couldn't we use these for something like a community garden? And it took a long time, but we are using some of these now for community gardens. There have been amazing new projects and pop-up markets started through the collective efforts to begin to distribute food to food insecure people, reclaiming some of these spaces. So I'll kind of move a little bit more quickly. This one I absolutely love. So many of my participants took photos of things that they perceived as problems. But this young participant took pictures of what they felt was beautiful. And their quote is, "I love this picture because I think it is beautiful. It shows the beauty of the West Side of Manchester. It shows that some people's thoughts about the West Side are wrong. If you are looking for the good in something, you will find it. But if you are focused on the bad, you will only see the negative." And this is one that has stuck with me my whole life. Those of you who've seen me present, I almost always present this because it's such an example of transformational resilience. This young person came from a war-torn country, relocated to Manchester, and was able to find beauty and remind us about the things in our lives that are beautiful and the privilege of living with beauty. And then more recently, this is actually from another participant living in a different neighborhood who said, "Can we make neighborhoods like Rimmon Heights," which is the neighborhood that was shown before. One of the things that that neighborhood has done is use kind of ironwork to almost brand their community. You can see the little sign, and that was designed by an artist to just say, this is our place, this is our neighborhood. And it's simple, but so many people notice it. And in this case, they even felt that it helped to slow traffic. It helped to create safer streets because that piece of art was something that enabled people to slow down and have safer streets at the same time. This one I'll just let you read for ourselves. I think, again, it shows how the design of our built environment can create places where resilience can be amplified. And another example of both personal and community resilience through designing a skate park where all people can participate. I just love this quote. Okay. The last couple of photos are ones from older adults. So we looked at youth, and then my colleague Ana Adachi Mejia and I did some wonderful photo voice work with older people who talked about their experience of aging in New Hampshire. And we did a project which was about empowering older adults of color and people who usually were either not speaking English as their first language or sometimes had just arrived from another country and were still mostly communicating in their home country's language. So there were some challenges with what can be perceived as linguistic barriers, mobility limitations, people who might have physical disabilities, and just people who are experiencing aging in a new place. So they had, again, left their home country. So I'll show you some examples from this project. I'm going to move through this a little fast, but we were really trying to learn about the lived experience, in this case, of getting older. So many of our older adult participants shared, again, those home beautification kinds of photos, things like creating a personal altar. We had folks from Nepal and Bhutan and some different countries were creating these little ways that they can connect back with things that they found to be personal sanctuaries were really important, sometimes little areas where they could plant things and bring nature into their home. So I think these are just small in-home kind of interior spaces that connected to beauty again. And then we also had many participants speak about the importance of green space and greening the environment, also creating ways where people can rest. So you'll see the benches, and I believe this was a hospital or a healthcare facility, but people really talked about how just the ability to have a small place where it was green and a place to rest when you were going to the doctor or going and coming from the doctor, which can be stressful for some people. Having that chance to just sit amid a small green space, breathe the air, and to walk was so profound for them. And many, many participants commented on variations on that theme. And then we also had some who reconnected to planting things, growing things. Many of our participants had gardens in their home country and were finding ways to re-engage with gardening here in their new home. So these are all examples of natural resources that participants felt were their places of sanctuary. There are places where they found what we call presencing, and they also, through photo voice, were able to raise awareness about the importance of these places. And then they talked about the arts. They talked a lot about how for many of these older persons, the ability to engage in everything from tapestries to quilting to playing the drums served in their minds these interconnected functions. It kept them socially engaged. Many of them felt it helped them with physical activity because playing the drums can be pretty vigorous. It kept them doing things like cognitively sharp, doing math. Quilting, I guess, takes a lot of, I don't quilt, but I wish I did. I guess you really have to think a lot about how you are going to use the different fabric and keeping your mind engaged. So hands, minds, bodies all engaged. And for them, this was all about wellness. Those things couldn't be separated. And also civic action, so a lot about volunteering and working with youth through music, through the arts. So these were themes that cut across the different cultures: social connection, culturally sensitive social engagement, access to places of worship, usually thinking about nature as sanctuary, and access to natural resources was so important to their well-being. So we're getting toward the end here. These were just some of the ways in which participants felt that this photo voice experience, which was quite short, I think we did, I believe it was 4 weeks, but I'll have to check that. They developed collective and critical awareness of their communities, transformed their self-perception, extended their social networks. So they did end up speaking to policymakers. Some of the folks who said, but my voice never matters. No one has ever asked me. Through this project, met with people who make decisions in their communities. And that was a real change for them. And they forged new connections with both academic partners, people from other communities, and participated in other community events. So lastly, these are just some of the ways you've seen examples of how we can work together to build both collective action and that transformational resilience component. So I think we've seen examples of the different themes shown in the little squares here. And I just wanted to end again with returning to the memory of my dad, but also celebrating a few other important people: my mom, Margaret Aytur, and my mother-in-law, my wonderful mother-in-law, Mary Bucci, who also passed away in September. So we've had some losses in our family, but they have shared such amazing memories with us. And I'm going to share a piece of art from each of those individuals. My dad, who loved going outside in the mountains and walking, and fall was one of his favorite seasons. So this is one of my dad's fall paintings. And my mom, who I already showed you, one of her watercolors during the last year of her life. And Mary Bucci, also an amazing watercolorist, produced so many amazing paintings for her family that lives on. And this is mine. So I ended with one of my own watercolors, but also there's a little survey at the end and a QR code. If you know an artist that you love, maybe you are an artist, or just anything you want to share, any comments, use the QR code or the link, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Semra, it's Reb, and
Hi, Reb.
I just want to thank you so much for this amazing presentation that brings together the arts and healing, and that experience that you shared a little bit earlier about becoming one with your creation, whatever that is. That could be knitting, it could be a painting, it could be a sculpture, is in my experience, a very healing experience. And this was just a really wonderful explanation of how you have come to see that and share that with the rest of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Reb. And I hope you don't mind, Reb shared that they are also an artist, which I didn't know. So I'm so happy that I now know that about you, Reb. So thank you for sharing your experience and for all the work that you do. Thank you.
A photo for a second. Picture of the neighborhood.
The Rimmon Heights one.
Yeah, why do you think that had the impact of slowing the traffic down?
You know, people hypothesize that it's two things. One is just that just seeing something, you know, people see it and they just are not speeding as I think just a cognitive reflex. But the other thing that people said is that this came up a number of times, that the signage helped create the impression, or this is the hypothesis, that people care about that neighborhood. That idea of something visual representing care has come up over and over again, a little bit like if you're familiar with the broken windows hypothesis, which is litter does the opposite. If there's trash and things that look unkept, people will think nobody cares about a neighborhood. This is kind of a sociology theory, and therefore people are more likely to commit crimes. They're more likely to engage in negative behaviors if they think people do not care. And this, I think, a little of the opposite. If you see signage or you see something that just shows people care about this place, it's the home of people who have some pride in this place, that it just seems to shift people out of more negative behaviors and into some more positive. Not, that's an oversimplification, but it's been kind of noticed in, I think, different ways. And people mentioned it a number of times, but I don't know, you know, I don't know for sure. It's a good question.
So there's a chat, but I also have a question after. I don't have my glasses.
Oh, it was just I think there's no such one. Thank you.
Well, my question, I keep thinking of this woman, Lily Yee, when we're talking, you know Lily Yee?
I don't.
She's an art, she wrote a book called The Barefoot Artist, but she uses art as a way of working with communities that have been through natural disaster, and she uses the remnants of destruction to build art with people in community to get healing happening in the community. It's beautiful, but I'll remember to send.
Yeah, please send me. Is it YEE or
YEH?
I'd love to see that.
But I was thinking, you know, when it comes to art, and we were talking about art as a social determinant, and today in one of my classes, I played a song. We were talking about health insurance, and it was a friend of mine in Oregon who recorded it. It's not published yet, but the line was, you don't need health insurance, you just need good health care. And he's, you know, from the generation of, like, you know, when music was a form of resistance, and it makes me think of art as a form of resistance. And it's like, it can be politically incorrect, or it can kind of push against the social structures that are like considered norm, but still be societally acceptable.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's one of the last forms of anything that can actually do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's a great point. Or even some forms of graffiti art and things like that. Yeah, that's great. And I know John and I were in New Zealand. I know some of you knew this, and they have such great public art there. Like almost the entire buildings are probably what here would be considered graffiti, but it's encouraged. It's like really, and it's amazing. You can just see so much art, and pretty much every brick building is covered with artwork.
Yes.
And it's, some of it is protest and some of it is just imaginative, but you're right, Suzanne. I think that's such a great point.
I mean, you reminded me of a sculpture, I can't remember if it's in Copenhagen or Stockholm, of a pistol with a big knot in it.
Mhm.
That is, clearly it's a message, but but the message is of, anti-gun, anti-resisting.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. You're right. That's very true. And I can think of, once I start thinking about it, more and more comes to mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anyone?
We have a-
Oh,
yeah, we have one
thanks.
chat. So Laura Tillman, I'm curious what role you see for non-visual arts, music, theater, etc., as well as pop culture arts, feature films, pop music, etc., versus high arts.
Great, yeah. So, well, I'll speak first about the dance one, because one of the ones I didn't show, my first photo voice ever, actually, I worked with a community in North Carolina where the older people were concerned that the younger generations weren't really connected to their heritage anymore. This is sort of a long story. And so they wanted to do a photo voice about traditional African dance, because that was what the grandparents had learned, and they were worried that nobody was practicing it anymore. So they did a photo voice, and the photo voice was capturing the dance, which is a little hard to imagine, but it was so powerful to just see these young people who learned the different ways in which the traditional dances worked. And then the cool thing is it became so popular, maybe a little bit of the popular culture, that people from all over would come. It ended up being like at a fairgrounds, and they would do the dances, and it started out like, let's do it for our grandparents. They'll come, but then everybody would come from miles and miles and miles around to watch the celebration of culture. And I never forgot that. So I think the power of, anything, movement, art installations, it's just incredible. And the pop art piece, I confess, I know it's tremendously important. I think that's where my students have more knowledge than I do. And I learn from my students about that, because there are ways in which we're even using social media and technology as art that maybe no one knew about before. So I welcome examples. If anyone has examples, send them my way. And maybe Suzanne, you know of some, but I'm open to learning.
I just wanted to also comment, I think that, you mentioned music and dance, and I just think music is incredibly powerful, especially if it's synthetic with words, and ideas, and bringing in choral work, people singing.
Oh, right. Yes.
So you just have to look at
That's true.
Seeger had in his lifetime.
Yeah.
The songs that he wrote, and
Yeah.
and it's still happening. Thank goodness.
It's amazing. And again, even little things, one thing that came to mind about music, I remember during the pandemic, it was Easter, and I don't know, I think this is still going on, but there was the Hallelujah chorus. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's people around the world of all faiths, all ethnicities, who on Zoom sang the Hallelujah chorus together. And it was just incredible. And I think they kept doing it, although I think they probably want to do it in person when it's not COVID probably, but on Zoom, these people from around the world, it was just amazing. So
That's
no, it was the part of the Handel's Messiah one, although that would be good too. They probably have done that too, for all I know. So yeah, it's just all of these voices, and they're all in their little Zoom square, which, if you describe, you think, how could that be powerful? But it really was, Yeah. Other questions?
Any other questions here in the room or online?
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who was able to join us on Zoom. A special thank you to all of our members. We're going to put another link in the chat. So if you're interested in becoming a member.
Oh, it's Cindy's.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's, I think she's applauding.
Oh, is that a plus?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so if you're interested in supporting the museum and all of our ongoing exhibitions and programs similar to this one, then we encourage you to visit our support page and hopefully become a member. But thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. So
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you coming out today.